With our last two blocks in the scraps, strips, strings, and crumbs series, we have explored different applique techniques. But we have one more applique technique to explore, and that's turned edge applique. So let's wind up our bobbins and let's get this block started. Thus far in this series, we have used our strings and crumbs to create some funky looking traditional quilt blocks. Then we explored some different applique techniques, first using a dryer sheet, then doing raw edge applique. In this video, we will explore a turned edge, or sometimes called prepared edge technique, using freezer paper. But before we get started with that, let's gather all of our quilt blocks we have created thus far to see how the quilt is looking. So what I'm noticing with this crumb version of the quilt is there's a lot of grays and dark colors here. And so I figure if I'm going to put a sashing on it, I want to have a color that is a pop. Make it a little bit more cheerful. So I'm auditioning this red fabric here. And thus far, I kind of like it, but we're only halfway done with this quilt, so there could be other things that I can do. I'm gonna start incorporating a lot more brighter colors, such as this red or the orange, maybe a yellow, something a lot more cheerful, a lot more bright, because I can see the gray, this color, as well as the black. I mean, there's a lot of that going on. And it doesn't seem very multicolored to me, because I do see a lot of this green as well in the fabric or in the crumb pieces. We're only halfway done, so I can still kind of pivot my way and redo some of these things. Moving over to the string version, I do see a lot of color. And that's a good thing. So when it comes to the whether to sash it or not, I definitely do want to put some kind of sashing, but we don't want the sashing to overpower all of the color that's in the block. So I'm looking at doing more of a neutral tone, such as this brown here. And I might want to turn either the crumb version or the string version and just put it on point, or I might just kind of interchange some of these blocks. We'll have to see about that, but at least now I'm getting the process of finishing or finalizing the quilt design. Since we're halfway done, I'm starting to look at things like that, so that if I need to change aspects of it going forward, I still got time to do that. So to make our blocks, we're going to be using some tools that are not traditionally used in quilting. So let's have a look at all the supplies that we're going to need. So this should be of no surprise. I got my 6.5-inch string blocks and my 4.5-inch crumb blocks. Now with the crumb blocks, I'm going to use these as my background. So I am going to need 9 of these crumb blocks, and I'm going to sew it together to make a 12.5-inch square. Now, the reason why I'm using the crumb blocks as the background instead of for the applique piece, this technique doesn't really lend itself to use the crumb blocks very easily. I mean, you can do it, but when you see later on as we start constructing our applique pieces, because of all of the seams that are in the crumb blocks, it'll be hard to actually create the applique piece because of that extra bulk with all the seam allowances. So I'm just going to use these crumb blocks to make the background for the block. Now with the string blocks, I don't have as bulky a seam, or don't have as many seams so close together. So I think I can get away with using the string blocks for our applique pieces. So I'm not sure exactly what type of design I'm going to do for this. Haven't quite figured that part out, so I'm not really sure how many string blocks I'm gonna need, but just for safekeeping, I just pulled out 4 of them. Now I did go through my larger scrap bins, and I pulled out these 2 particular fabrics, in which this purple, I am going to use it as the background for the string block. And then I wanted to incorporate this red because, as I said, there's not a whole punch of color on one of the quilts. So I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to use this. Now, I might need to go back into my scrap or larger scrap bin because, again, I don't know what my applique design is going to be. And so I might not use this red, or I might use it, who knows. But I guess when the time comes, we'll know. Now, for this technique, I'm going to actually use starch. Now, all of us probably have starch in our quilting room. This is the Stay Flow. This is actually a starch concentrate. And you don't need a whole gallon jug like this. You really just need a small amount, maybe like about a half a cup or so. And with the starch, what you will do is you're going to apply it to the applique piece, and you're going to be starching what I'm going to call the applique seam allowance. And you're going to use the starch to actually make sure that the applique piece holds its shape. This will probably make more sense once you start seeing the technique. But there's other things there's other techniques that other quilters do. They use glue. They will sometimes use some other manufactured or synthetic material. But I figure all of us have starch, so we can use that. Now, if you don't have a starch concentrate like this, and you got maybe a spray bottle or the aerosol version of it, take a small container and just spray it directly into that container. And when the fizz and all the carbonation, whatever you call it, kind of settles down, you'll get your liquid starch in there. Oh, by the way, it's also handy to have this small little container. Now, I got this from the Dollar Tree, $1.25. And speaking of Dollar Tree, I also got this set of paint brushes. Now, there's a larger brush and there's this smaller brush. I'm going to use the starch, or I'm going to use these to apply the starch to the applique piece. And so I'm kind of experimenting. Is it better with the bigger size brush, or is it better with the smaller size brush? Now, if you don't want to pick up, or if you don't have a set of brushes, you can use Q-tips. I've used just paper napkins, anything to just kind of soak up the starch and apply it onto the fabric. That'll do. And again, you don't need the most fancy of equipment. Again, these are just from Dollar Tree. They're not the best brushes in the entire world. So, just use what you got. So this is Reynolds freezer paper. You get it from the grocery store. You can pick up a roll fairly inexpensively. And freezer paper there's two different sides to it. There's a paper side, and there's a side where there's a wax coating. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking this freezer paper, cutting it down to smaller sizes. And on the paper side, we're going to use this to draw our design. Then we're going to cut it out, and this freezer paper is just basically going to be used as a template to create our applique pieces. The wax side, the thing about this wax is it's a very good temporary adhesive. If you iron wax paper onto the back of your fabric, which is what we're going to be doing, it'll adhere itself, but it's not going to stick permanently. You'll be able to actually peel it off. So when we start making our applique pieces, you'll see what I mean. Now, when it comes to freezer paper, I'm not sure if there's other brands, quite honestly, because at the grocery store, I only saw Reynolds, but I'm pretty sure that any brand will work. So I think that's all that we're going to need. So yeah, let's get started making our blocks. First, I need to prepare the freezer paper templates. Now, some quilters like to use one layer or one piece of freezer paper. I personally like to use 2 layers or 2 pieces of freezer paper to make it a bit more stiff and stable. I lay the wax side of both layers of the freezer paper face down, then iron them together. On the paper side, I trace the design. Now for my string pieces, I will be making different size circles in which I just searched for any round shape around the house and just trace that. On the crumb version, I will be using this Missouri Star Quilt Company orange peel template, cut out the shapes from the freezer paper, make sure that you're not using your good fabric scissors for this and you are cutting on the line. Iron the freezer paper template onto the wrong side of your applique fabric. Now make sure that the wax side of the freezer paper faces the wrong side of your fabric so that it will temporarily adhere to the back of the fabric. Trim the fabric about 1/4 inch away from the freezer paper. This will create what I refer to as your applique seam allowance. This does not have to be an exact 1/4 inch. The idea here is to trim away the excess bulk to make it easier to turn that applique seam allowance. On curved edges like this circle, you will want to cut little slits in the fabric, or what I'm calling your seam allowance. I'm cutting up to the freezer paper, but trying not to cut the freezer paper itself. This will help with the next step as you turn that seam allowance. With your paintbrush or whatever tool you're using, start applying the starch to the applique seam allowance. I try to apply the starch close to the edge of the freezer paper as possible, but a lot of times I just overlap right onto the freezer paper itself. I usually end up soaking the entire seam allowance, but I feel that the most important spot is right on the edges of the freezer paper. Apply the starch to small sections at a time because in the next step, you will be using the iron and don't necessarily want to dry out the starch yet on the entire applique piece. Now with your stiletto or whatever turning tool you have, flip the applique seam allowance onto the freezer paper. As you turn or flip the seam allowance, gently, and I do say gently, pull the seam allowance so that where the fabric folds over is right up against the freezer paper edges. Do your best at smoothing it out so that there are no puckers or no unintentional points. Then hit it with the iron to seal it in that position. Take your time with this because it does take practice. After all the applique seam allowances are starched, turned, and ironed, you can remove the freezer paper. It should peel off fairly easily. You can reuse that same freezer paper template to make more of the same applique pieces if necessary. I can usually reuse it to make 3 additional applique pieces, sometimes more so long as the wax doesn't wear off. Eventually, the wax from the freezer paper melts away and can no longer temporarily adhere to the fabric, in which it's time to make a new freezer paper template. You may need to do some adjustments to the applique piece after removing the freezer paper. I do find that some things shift, or the applique seam allowances doesn't hold its shape, so I press it once more. Arrange the applique pieces on the background fabric. Once you are happy with the layout, you can pin each piece into place. I will be using a straight stitch and top stitching each applique piece. You can use an applique stitch, a blanket stitch, a zigzag, or even a satin stitch, or some other decorative stitch that your machine has. Whatever decorative stitch you choose, just make sure that the stitches cross over the edges of the applique piece and onto the background fabric. But since my Juki machine is a straight stitch only, I will be top stitching the applique piece. I will top stitch as close to the edge of the applique piece as I can. Now some quilters will choose to backstitch at the start and end. I choose not to. Instead, I will start sewing, stitch around the applique piece, and as I come back to my starting point, I will overlap the stitches. This is just to secure the applique piece and make sure that my stitches don't unravel. Ooh, what is that? It's just coffee. Yeah, it's a little too early in the morning. Actually, it's about 5 a.m. in the morning. Sometimes you just gotta squeeze in some quilting time, even if it is at 5 a.m. in the morning. Now, I'm going to make a statement, and don't get me wrong, I do love quilting, but there are certain aspects of it in which I just despise. And I do know that there's a lot of you out there that, well, don't like applique quilting. And so that kind of got me thinking about something. You know, there's certain aspects about quilting that I just don't really love doing. One of them is binding. Oh my gosh. Yeah, for whatever reason, I just hate to bind a quilt. I mean, it's ironic because after all of that, putting the top together, getting it quilted, you're almost there to the finish line, and yet you don't want to do the last step. Go figure that one. And I do know that there are other quilters out there that don't like to bind. And I know there's a handful of you guys that are not enjoying these applique blocks because you don't like applique. That's fine. But what are some things about quilting that you don't like? Put a comment down below. Let everybody know, hey, what aspect of quilting is it that you don't like? Are you a person that doesn't like to do the actual quilting? That's not me. No, I have a long arm, for crying out loud. Or are you like me where you don't like to do the binding? It's like you're there, you're almost there at the finish line. You got one more thing to do, and that's the one part that you really don't like doing. Here's an awkward one. I really hate spending the time preparing the fabric. You know, starching it, cutting it to the correct sizes. Yeah, I could spend all day just cutting fabric, and I really don't like doing that. Which is why a lot of the quilts that I do, or a lot of the quilt designs that I create, are kind of pre-cut friendly because, hey, that's one step out of the way. But what are some things about quilting that you're not so crazy about? Again, put a comment down below. Let all of us know. And more importantly, how do you get around it? Are you a quilter by check? Or do you pay somebody else to do your binding? Hey, if anybody out there wants to make money doing binding, let me know. But then again, the cost of shipping these days for shipping a quilt, I don't think will justify the cost of having someone else do your own binding. Checks and balances, right? What are some other things that I really hate? Well, on the flip side, there are certain things that I do love about quilting, like the fact of, you know, you're creating something. Growing up, I was always kind of a person that liked to work with my hands. I also am the type of person where if I look at something, I want to see what the possibilities of that something are. Case in point, you take an IKEA bookshelf. I try to use it not just as a bookshelf. Could it be a cutting table? Can you turn it into a bar? Maybe a dining table. Maybe you use it as a partition for a room. Who knows? Yeah, I'll take a look at stuff. Well, I'll use it for what it's made for, but then I'll try and see, are there other uses for it? That's just the way I am. And of course, I love to look at fabric. But then again, what quilter doesn't? All right, so I think I sewed all my applique pieces, so let's wrap up this video. And so I got my blocks done. This is the crumb version of the block, and I ended up pulling out this particular fabric from my larger scrap bin. I am definitely glad that I decided not to use the crumb blocks to make the applique pieces, simply because, again, there's a lot of bulk with those seam allowances. Although it's not quite flat, I might have to actually hit it with the iron and starch it a little better, but I'm happy with it. And again, because I top stitched it down, I just went as close as I could to the edges as I possibly could. And here's the string version. Now, what I'm not 100% satisfied with is that on some of these blocks, I didn't quite turn the edges. So you do have some points that are peeking out here. If that really were to bother me, I would just probably take this apart and do it all over again, but it's not going to bother me that much. And when you put it in the overall quilt, you're probably not going to notice it, or Hopefully you won't notice it. I'm not going to change it. I'm just going to leave it as it is. So just be aware of that as you're turning your edges. Do your best at getting those edges or trying to smoothing out those points. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoy making your own turned edge applique using freezer paper. If you haven't done so, you can join the Treasure Heart Creations Facebook group. And hint, hint, there's going to be an exclusive giveaway connected to this video. So head on over to the Treasure Heart Creations Facebook group to find out more about that. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and click on subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications on when I upload my next video. Till then, go out and create something.